first of all, then, how did you become interested in the area of demonic possession?
Well, Mr. Dutton, I'm a physician, so I spend my life trying to help people. And that really was my motivation when a fairly prominent American priest exorcist came to my office. I was at Cornell Medical College at the time. And he told me that he had a case of a woman that he thought was demonically not possessed, but what they call oppressed. And he wanted me to evaluate her. And I remember telling him, I said, Father, with all due respect, I've just finished my psychiatric training at Yale, and I'm a little skeptical of that stuff. And I remember he said with a smirk, well, then Dr. Gallagher, you're the perfect man for the job. In other words, they wanted someone who was essentially coming into this area with a certain amount of skepticism. When I was a resident in psychiatry, there was a lot of hysteria about Satanists in America. It was what they call the era of the satanic panic, where, myriad people were claiming that kids were being kidnapped. I studied abuse and abused kids, and there were reports that 50,000 kids in America were being kidnapped by Satanists. Now, I knew darn well that there weren't 50,000 missing children, and most of those were runaways. So again, I went into this field skeptical. I went into this field not volunteering for anything, but just to try to respond to people who were asking my help and advice as a psychiatrist.
So, what are the mainstream theories as to what, or as it were, as to what causes demonic possession? What's the general view among the psychiatric profession of what's going on with something like The Exorcist or whatever?
Well, it's hard to generalize the psychiatric profession. I mean, I attend a meeting of what's called the International Association of Exorcists as a scientific advisor every couple of years, and there are quite a few Catholic psychiatrists on that organization. So there are psychiatrists around the world who believe exactly the way I do.
Sure, but before we go into what you believe, what would be, as it were, the scientific view as to what causes demonic possession? What's the more mainstream view, so that we can compare the two?
Well, again, I do want to emphasize that it depends on what mainstream you're talking about. The belief in possession and evil spirits throughout history has been a very widespread belief. Now, if you're talking about modern psychiatry, understandably, psychiatrists who see people who either imagine or are deluded into thinking they have a demonic attack, people who hallucinate, for instance, these psychiatrists are going to tend to overgeneralize. So one scientific view, because I don't regard my view as unscientific, I regard my view as scientific as well. But one scientific view is that these are mentally disturbed individuals. And I wrote a book about this whole subject. It's a complicated subject. It's called Demonic Foes. It's published by HarperCollins, and I try to identify the different psychiatric illnesses that are sometimes mistaken by fundamentalists or various more naive people as possessions, when of course they're just mental illness. These include conditions like schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, certain personality disorders where people are struggling with, say, antisocial or very destructive impulses. I mean, there are people, again, fundamentalists, who believe that these are misascribed, that these are possessed individuals, and of course, they're simply mentally ill individuals. This is the main alternative theory to the more mainstream Western Christian view that we're dealing with evil spirits.
So why is it that when people are in high levels of stress or whatever, and perhaps they have certain traits which relate to mental illness, some people have a positive religious experience where they hear the voice of God and they have a conversion or whatever, and they feel a positive, and it helps them out and it makes them kind of get better, and it's a positive thing, and their lives are centered around this positive thing. But then other people, it's a really not unpleasant, not nasty experience. What's the difference between those two kinds of people?
Well, I mean, by and large, people who are mentally ill do not have pleasant experiences. It is true that every once in a while, somebody who's psychotic, especially if they're sort of in a manic state or something, they may feel euphoric about the experience. But again, here we're talking about people who are deluded. We're not talking about, there is another group of people, you might say it's an alternative theory, that certain people have paranormal experiences of one sort or another, but that's a whole nother subject.
Okay, and so sorry, I just closed the door. The children are still stressed about the internet. So okay, so and why is it as well that a lot of these films that you have about demonic experiences and so forth, they seem to happen to teenage girls, girls that have just started menstruating or something, teenage girls. Why is that? Why is it that age group that it seems to be? Is that accurate, the way it's portrayed in these movies? That it happens?
Again, if you're talking about people susceptible to certain deluded ideas, thinking they're possessed or something, there may be a little bit of truth to that. But by and large, in reality of people who are actually demonically possessed, it can affect either gender, any age. There is no preponderance of teenage girls.
Okay, and so you started off skeptical of this, and presumably you took what you were saying, the more mainstream view that it is, or that it's mental illness. So can you tell us about your journey into being less skeptical, and why that happened?
Well, the original case that I wrote up was of a woman who claimed that evil spirits were attacking her, physically attacking her. And she had come from about 2,000 miles away to be evaluated by this prominent American exorcist, Catholic priest, at a time when there were very few of them in America. And I was asked to evaluate her. She had bruises all over her body. She gave a very credible story. She was not particularly disturbed in any way. We did some tests on her, some bleeding tests. We checked her platelets. We even did a CAT scan and that sort of thing. And I had to admit to the priest that this dramatic story that she was giving about sitting in her house and literally feeling physically attacked, beaten by invisible forces, appeared to be a credible story. It was verified, by the way, by many of her friends and her husband, who, would be observing this happening helplessly. And I said, well, Father, I cannot find any medical or psychiatric reason why this woman would be experiencing this very bizarre experience. And he said, well, thank you, Dr. Gallagher. That's what I thought. I wanted to make sure she didn't have a disorder, but this is what we call a oppression. So after that, I came to be referred or asked to evaluate, would be a better way of putting it, because these are not patients of mine, Professor Dutton. I'm not treating these individuals. I'm just doing a scientific diagnosis. Now, it turns out that a lot of the people that I see who think they are possessed are mentally ill. But in some of these cases, the phenomena is so bizarre and ranges over what we call the paranormal, although the more technical spiritual term is preternatural, that there seems to be no other explanation, but that something spiritual is going on of a nefarious nature. So I've wound up seeing a tremendous amount. Well, I wouldn't say a tremendous amount, but I've seen probably 800 or 900 people in the course of 25 years who have some kind of demonic attack, and in a certain subset of those who I believe unequivocally are demonically possessed.
So you actually believe in? Do you think that you have reasoned your way to believing that there is some sort of spiritual universe via your studies, via your work, or did you believe that already?
Well, I was brought up Catholic. I didn't exactly see, especially after my psychiatric training, I didn't believe that I was going to see these cases that are reported throughout history. So I would say that I wasn't predisposed to either believe or not to believe, but I have found in the years since I've probably seen more of these cases than any other physician in history, because of electronic communications, that sort of thing. And I've been asked to evaluate people all over the world. I've probably seen more of these cases than any physician in history, and absolutely, I believe that that's the best explanation.